It's that glorious time of year again, when the sweltering summer gives way to fall and football season. But the crisp fall air isn't upon us yet. As preseason practices begin and football players start getting into shape, the physical dangers of heat and humidity must be prepared for to enable the prevention of serious negative consequences. Welcome to USA Football's Heat Emergency Preparedness video.
Hi, I'm Sam Ramsden, athletic trainer for the Seattle Seahawks. If you're a youth football coach, member of a coaching staff, or like me, an athletic trainer, please take the next few minutes to learn how to prevent heat illness and how to react if a player should succumb to dehydration or heat stroke. One day, your heat emergency preparedness could save a player's life.
This video will cover the following topics: acclimation, communication, heat illness, dehydration, heat stroke, heat emergency preparedness, and heat emergency and response.
Let's start with a term all coaches should be familiar with as their seasons begin: acclimation, which means to become accustomed to a new climate or environment. This will be important, if not vital, to remember during summer practices as players' bodies adapt to heat and seek ways to efficiently cool down.
Statistics show that most early season deaths occur in the first 4 days of practice. Days 1 and 2 are the most dangerous, as most players will not report to camp or practice physiologically prepared for the environmental stresses, preseason conditioning, and football uniforms that will tax their bodies.
Players, fresh off their air-conditioned vacations, will need a 10 to 14-day period to get acclimated to the climate and environment of preseason football. So it is imperative that coaches incorporate at least a 2-week acclimation period into their football programs. Let's consider another term that's important when helping players acclimate to the preseason heat and humidity: communication.
Communicate with your players, their parents, and your coaching staff about heat preparedness. Get ahead of the game. Hold meetings with parents and players that cover ways to get used to the summer heat before preseason practice begins. Send players home with letters that let their parents or guardians know that they should prepare for heat by initiating an outdoor activity schedule. For example, 2 weeks before practice, begin a daily outdoor exercise regimen that includes 15 to 20 minutes of exercise in the early morning or late evening. Maintain a steady sweat throughout the activity, and as the days pass, add minutes to the activity's duration. Gradually schedule your workouts closer to your head coach's normal practice times. Exercise in groups for safety, and stop exercising if you start to feel bad. As a coach, once you let them know the plan, it's important that you follow through. Make sure your players are following the plan and taking it as seriously as they would other parts of your football program.
Though you can't control how and where players exercise in their time off, you can control their environment during practice. And of course, this begins with communication. Discuss the goals for the day's practice indoors or in the shade, away from the summer heat. During that discussion, let them know that it's okay to let you know if they're feeling bad, or if they suspect a teammate is feeling bad. Let them know that it's okay to put pride aside. They can sit out a drill or two or cool off without repercussions. Keep in mind that each case will present itself differently, depending on the individual and how long he's waited to communicate his problem. It's possible that a player may need to sit out for the remainder of practice, and that's okay, because players' safety comes first.
To avoid the intense midday heat, schedule early morning and late afternoon practices, and keep those practices at 90 minutes or 2 hours in duration. Schedule breaks every 30 minutes, preferably in the shade with water or a sports drink available, and don't finish practices with intense exercises like sprints.
On a hot day, a football uniform can increase the risk of heat-related illness by doubling or tripling the player's heat insulation factor.
The irony in preseason football heat preparedness can be found in the form of the game's protective equipment. While helmets and pads protect players during the regular season, if not introduced gradually, they can put the player at risk during the preseason.
If heat cannot escape through a player's pads, it will increase that player's body temperature. To avoid this insulation factor, coaches should gradually introduce the uniform during the acclimation period.
USA Football proposes a preseason practice schedule that incorporates both heat and uniform acclimation over a 2-week period. On days 1 and 2, hold single-session practices and wear helmets, t-shirts, and shorts only. Do not incorporate contact of any kind, and don't practice for more than 2 hours. Remind your players that it's okay to let you know if they're feeling bad, or if they suspect a teammate is feeling bad. Let them know that it's okay to put pride aside. They can sit out a drill or two, or cool off and call it a day without repercussions. Continue single-session practices on days 3 and 5, but feel free to incorporate shoulder pads, as this will allow your players to gradually acclimate to the uniform and the heat. For now, keep live contact drills out of your practice plan, and stay under the 2-hour duration limit. And remember, the first few days of practice pose the highest risk of heat-related illness, so tell your players it's okay to put pride aside. On day 6, introduce full uniforms, but maintain a single practice session. Let your players hit the sleds and the pads, but stay away from live contact. Again, keep your practice duration under 2 hours. Giving your players a break is a good idea, so take the 7th day off. This will give them a chance to adequately hydrate. Next, let's talk about starting single-session and double-session practices. USA Football recommends that youth coaches stick to single-session practices. For days 8 through 13, keep your single sessions at a 2-hour duration limit. If your organization or high school program incorporates double-session practices, now is the time to introduce them. But they should only take place every other day, and should start no earlier than day 8. When double sessions begin, alternate 2-a-day practices with 1-a-day practices. Stick with full pads if you desire, but remain cognizant of the heat, humidity, and duration of practice. A 2-hour duration is okay for a single practice, but on double session days, do not exceed a combined duration of 4 hours. And be sure to give your players at least a 3-hour break in a cool environment between sessions. A break that lasts a minimum of 3 hours in a cool environment will give your players sufficient recovery time in which to rest, cool off, rehydrate, and resupply their bodies with nutrients. Make the 14th day a day off. This will get your players rested and ready for your customized practice schedule. So there you have it, a great template for the first 2 weeks of practice that incorporates 2 potentially life-saving elements: acclimation and communication.
Now that we know how to best avoid heat illness and that it's okay for players to put pride aside, let's go over the signs and symptoms of dehydration and heat stroke.
Dehydration is defined as a loss of body water. A football player with below normal levels of body water is more susceptible to a rise in body temperature, muscle cramps, and premature fatigue.
Research shows that a player's thirst mechanism won't kick in until he's lost about 2% of his body weight in sweat. For example, a player who weighs 200 pounds may lose 4 pounds before he develops a pressing thirst. Quenching thirst isn't enough. This will not account for 25 to 50% of the fluids lost. In simple terms, don't wait to hydrate. Create an environment where coaches and teammates are vigilant in recognizing the signs of dehydration and incorporate regular fluid breaks into your practice schedule. Players should replace fluids and electrolytes every 15 to 20 minutes.
Water is acceptable, but sports drinks are preferred for several reasons. The electrolytes and flavor in sports drinks stimulate thirst and encourage drinking. They contain sodium, which promotes fluid retention and decreases the risk of severe muscle cramps. And they have carbohydrates that provide energy to active muscle and improve the player's ability to work longer and harder. At the high school level, coaches can check if a player is dehydrated by having them weigh in at the beginning and end of practice. Daily weight loss is primarily a loss of fluid, not fat. If a player weighs in for practice at 155 pounds and weighs out at 150 pounds, he needs to replace enough fluids between practices to ensure he's back near his baseline weight. Without daily checks on weight and fluid loss, the dehydration factor will increase over time and become dangerous for the player.
A high school and youth football player can check if they're dehydrated by monitoring their urine. If the player's urine is dark in color, like apple juice, he is most likely dehydrated. If his urine is light in color, like lemonade, they are adequately hydrated. Parents and guardians should inquire about their young player's urine color, as it's a great indicator of hydration level. Definitely a question worth asking.
Heat stroke is a form of hyperthermia, an elevated body temperature. If precautions and emergency preparations aren't made, players who exert themselves in extreme heat and humidity run the risk of abnormally elevated body temperatures. Improper maintenance of body hydration exacerbates the risks. Unlike the less severe forms of hyperthermia, heat cramps, and heat exhaustion, heat stroke is a medical emergency that can be fatal if not properly treated.
Coaches should be familiar with the signs and symptoms of heat stroke, which can develop rapidly and without warning. They can include nausea, vomiting, fatigue, weakness, headache, muscle cramps, muscle aches, and dizziness. Other signs and symptoms to check for include elevating body temperature, absence of sweating with flushed skin, rapid pulse, breathing difficulty, strange behavior, hallucinations, confusion, agitation, disorientation, seizure, and coma.
Heat stroke can result in permanent brain damage and even death, so make sure you can recognize the signs and symptoms. Make sure your staff, players, and their parents understand the risks and have a plan of action in case of emergency.
A predetermined plan of action can save the life of an overheated player. Let's talk about cold water immersion. If a player goes down with what you suspect to be heat stroke, the first step is to begin cooling the athlete immediately. Somewhere on the practice field, preferably in the shade, have an ice-filled tub or a small pool prepped and ready for a heat-stricken player. Strip the player of his equipment, and assuming there is no potential for head or neck injury, place the athlete in the ice-filled tub and immerse the torso, from shoulders to hips. Being careful not to submerge the player's head. Keep the player's torso submerged and regularly monitor the player for responsiveness, pulse, and breathing until emergency medical technicians arrive and take over. For many football coaches on the youth and high school levels, cold water immersion isn't a possibility. So, in a heat stroke emergency, move the player to a shaded area and begin the cooling process by covering him in ice bags from shoulders to hips. Again, be sure to regularly monitor the athlete for responsiveness, pulse, and breathing. Remember, in this situation, seconds count. If done properly, immediate cooling can reduce the risk of permanent disability.
While the player is being cooled down with cold water, immersion, or ice bags, a predetermined member of the staff we'll call a crisis coordinator should call 911 to coordinate with EMS technicians. This staff member should carry a cell phone at all times, especially to the preseason practice field.
When calling 911, the crisis coordinator should provide all pertinent emergency information, including the school's name and address, directions, an initial assessment of the player's symptoms, and details about the treatment being given. The crisis coordinator should know the location of the practice field's EMS entry point, make sure it is accessible, and should meet paramedics at the front of the school or facility to direct them swiftly to the scene. Finally, the crisis coordinator should accompany the injured player to the hospital.
This concludes USA Football's Heat Emergency Preparedness video. Your familiarity with acclimation, communication, heat illness, dehydration and heat stroke, heat emergency preparedness, and heat emergency and response can one day save a player's life.
Thank you for taking the time to coach the game of football. It's your responsibility to keep the best interest of your players in mind at all times. On behalf of USA Football, I would like to wish you and your team the best of luck this season.
For more information and safety resources, visit usafootball.com.